Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, today is, last week was very special to have Professor Goody talking again, and today is also special in various ways. Partly because there are all sorts of distinguished people from other faculties and elsewhere here, and I welcome them all. I'll recommend them individually. But I would like to just particularly welcome Professor Rudolf Itz, who's the director of the Institute of Ethnography and Museum of Ethnography in Leningrad, who's here on a short visit, which is delightful to have him here, and yet another sign of thaw, you might say, between our cultures. And it's special also because we have with us as the speaker Claude Galey, who's already spoken once this afternoon, so his batteries will be wearing down somewhat. But he is unique in that he was the former director of the Centre of South Asian Studies, as the successor to Louis Dumont for 12 years. He is now a reader at the École des Hautes Études, and therefore no one could be in a better position to give us an inside view of that august and strange institution, an anthropologist working within it, and therefore it's appropriate that not only should he give us an inside view, but we should subject him to the same kind of thing that we subject our informants to, namely filming. So it's inversions within inversions within inversions. So the mirror, we look inside the mirror, and welcome Jean-Claude.
Thank you very much, Alan. And thank you very much for the department to have permitted these two talks in the same afternoon. So I really thank people for that. I mean, it's a bit too much, but anyway, that's how canning went sometimes. I must though confess that it's the first time that I'm likely to be put on tape, video tape. If it works, the way students sometimes record, but in seminars I have great hopes that nothing will come on the screen. But well, this exercise of presenting to you what I called a bit programmatically a ethnohistory of an academic institution has basically two purposes, and I must say that I owe the idea to the fact of being in Cambridge. It's because of a certain experience of a few months in a college in Cambridge and the relationship with fellows, which made me aware of the kind of specificity my school had, by similarities in many ways of the life in the college, and also by many differences, because colleges do not give grades and colleges are not officially teaching bodies the way the école is. Nevertheless, it's one of those exceptions in the French academic institutions that the School of the Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales has achieved for the last 40 years. And I would like to propose to you some very broad outline of the way it has been created, the purpose for which it had been created initially, the long period of latent history it had to deal through before being officially on the first line on the stage, the present development and situation it faces, and also certain kind of questioning I would have to raise a bit anxiously or maybe pessimistically in scope of its near future. So this exercise, in fact, is also the reverse of a normal anthropological exercise, because being myself part of this institution for the last 15 years, I would take that as an exercise of observant participation and trying not to be too much identified or too much critical about things I live with for now so long. Don't be scared about all these lines on the blackboard. They're just trying to help what I would try awkwardly to say in this English of mine. The first chart is giving some kind of a chronological table of how the institute took birth by being emancipated from a series of other institutes, but I will go back to that obviously later. The second is giving the chronological list of its president. And as you could see, they're all historians, but for the last, whom Professor Goody knows very well, And we also have to comment upon that, why all of a sudden an anthropologist has become president of a school which was basically an historical establishment. The third chart is giving the kind of internal demography of the teaching staff and the kind of degrees and number of students it had, and shows the evolution of 23 years. And you could also see some kind of very major changes, which also I would have to say a word about later on. The fourth is drawing a box, a central box, which is a kind of a vital brain of this institution, insofar as it is intimately coupled with two other institutes, who maybe you don't know or have just heard about casually, which is the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme and the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the CNRS being basically a center, a huge center sheltering many thousands of scholars in all subjects, part of them dealing with social sciences, and part of them being of the CNRS, being themselves attached to the école as subsidiary body of teaching and scholarly staff. The Maison des Sciences de l'Homme is originally, and we'll go back to that very soon, a private foundation, but because it was created by Brodel, who also, in fact, presided over the école for almost 20 years, not 20 years officially, but in fact more than 20 years from the background. This central box, being the vital brain of this, as you could see, is made up of three different institutions, but the way they intermingle, overlap, and complement one another in terms of budgetary lines, fundings, and manipulation and organization of projects of research, teaching centers, research centers, workshops, seminars and conferences, makes the École des Hautes Études practically undissociable from these two other institutions. And because of the growth of the CNRS itself these last 15 years, it definitely creates a very strong disbalance within the École itself, because most of the money for research is coming now from the CNRS, and the CNRS people, having become aware of it, are trying to put certain pressures on the directions through which lead to certain projects of research. But again, time is not too short. We'll detail that a little bit more. The fifth and last chart is the organigram. I don't know if it's the word in English. The organigram, which shows from the president how the power, executive and consultative, is distributed within the institution. You have the president, who is associated with a desk. I would call that in my Indian anthropological term the privy council. A desk he chooses himself and which remains all the time of his mandate, and with whom he has twice a week private meetings deciding over the major issues, both in terms of fundings, distribution of funds, and distribution of appointments within the institution. This desk and the head are making the vital nerve of the institute. It is assisted by an administrative board and a scientific board, both being, and no need to enter into detail, the administrative board is partly an emanation of the general teaching staff of all categories, and partly by a representative of external personalities, ministers, deputy ministers of the state ministries, and also important responsible person of the CNRS and of the MSH, both on different terms. For the administrative board is basically regulating intendance and infrastructure, whereas the scientific board is actually voting the scientific budget and the decisions which actually are made by those five people at the top. It's what we call in France une chambre d'enregistrement, though officially it is not meant to be there. Then at the bottom of it you have the teaching assembly, which is composed of all the directeurs d'études, which are the full professors, maîtres de conférence or readers, maîtres assistants or senior lecturers, chef de travaux or lecturer, junior lecturer. And then we have temporary lectures who are renewable every year without contract. And by associate, I mean both scholars who are either already teaching in universities at the Sorbonne or in other universities in France, and who come regularly to teach in the institute another course than the one they teach at the university, or people like Jacques Goudy or other foreign scholars who are invited regularly, more or less regularly, by their inner colleagues, directeurs d'études, to teach for a month or two every year or at certain periods and complement the scholarly program of the research institute. As you could see also, the student population has doubled, and the major difference between those two dates is that beforehand the school was not allowed to deliver doctoral theses, and from 77 it was allowed to give doctoral theses. Right, here we are for the first part. So the building of that school is located on the Boulevard Raspail in Paris, in the building which itself shelters the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. It is distributed between the general services and the teaching and research centers. These research centers are 70, and among those 70, 38 are subsidized or sponsored by the CNRS for their research funds. And you can see how much weight the CNRS has gained over those research centers. Apart from this heavy fundings from the CNRS, the school is playing with many various budgetary lines, which comes from the Ministry of Education for the main part, for the Ministry of Research, from the Ministry of Technical Cooperation, from the Ministry of Development, from the Ministry of External Affairs. Besides that, it also deals with international conventions like the British Academy or the British Council in England, in Germany with the same with Bielefeld University, for instance. It has various contracts with Brazilian, Indian, Asian universities with whom it has exchanges of scholars, and with the Erasmus project it tends to develop its own link within Europe. But I would say that so far the links have remained punctual and not really widespread. Besides that, the school, as it is a state institute, has no power to have contract with private bodies or private engineers or persons, but the research center can. It means that the research center of economy can have budgetary funds from the ministry and the state money, but also can have private and punctual contract with firms of engineering or firms of consulting agencies who would give them a certain contract to fulfill for a particular program of research. And of course, all these fundings are checked by the general accountant of the next to the president. Right, here is for the basic ethnography. Now, the main purpose, obviously, of my talk is not to give you all that kind of boring information, though maybe from a British point of view it's also interesting to see how this Jacobin Colbertist France is organized while it's celebrating its bicentenary of revolution, because my fancy sometimes is to compare those three big organisms as three expressions of historical regimes of the West. I don't know if my talk would make that clear, but and that is without any kind of bad gossip, it's just for the fun of it. But I mean, the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, created by Brodel in very particular context of where his power was challenged, is obviously functioning along a feudal model. Whereas the École des Hautes Études, as it was criticized heavily by the university and by many French other agencies, including ministries, was to be considered as an absolutist institution and very much called like Versailles and l'Ancien Régime of Louis XIV. So there we are with two periods of the French history with two institutions closely linked, and then came into the scene the CNRS, which actually was built after the Second World War, and in its design is very close to the way the Academy of Science has been organized in the Soviet Union. And therefore, the committees inside the CNRS have very much been under an absolute control of the trade unionism, and the policy of the CNRS is heavily checked and decided upon from the basis and through the trade unions. So there we are. We have the Ancien Régime, feudalism, and the post-revolutionary state all linked together in making social sciences exist in France nowadays. Well, now, the real reasons of that presentation to you is obviously to make some kind of an intellectual history of the institution. For I think, and to that extent I would very closely follow Pierre Bourdieu, that to produce one's own history for an institution that is devoted to social sciences is not only a fancy but a methodological imperative. So this understanding of the intellectual history and the epistemology at play during this foundation, development and culmination of the institution nowadays would maybe help us to understand the initial choices that took place, the initial conditions, the political conditions of the Third Empire, because the first time people were talking about the École was under Victor Durui's ministry of Napoleon III, and very much against Napoleon III's conservatism. And Victor Duruy, as you know, was a very progressist minister who played a decisive role in planning national education in France at the end of the 19th century. So the initial conditions of the creation of the school and the political limitations of its birth were somehow very interesting to describe, to understand the later development of the institution itself. And maybe in the course of time to see those initial choices which had been forgotten, transfigurated, or defaced. For that, I also rely on a certain number of publications. I may give you quickly the list of. It's about 5 books and 3 articles. There is a book published by the archivist of the École des Hautes Études, Brigitte Mazon. For those who are interested, I'm most willing to give you the detail of that book. Aux origines de l'École des Hautes Études, published last year in Paris. There is a book published by a high civil servant from l'Énarque called Couteau-Bégari, Le phénomène de la nouvelle histoire, grandeur et décadence de l'École des Annales, 1985, which is a very nasty book, but very well informed. So, I mean, if you can filter out the kind of mediocre and polemical argumentation, certain of the facts he says are quite unknown and quite relevant, for they are, I mean, footnotes are there, I mean, it's very well documented, and you cannot challenge this kind of information. And so, of course, you have the famous 2 articles of Jacques Revel and Emmanuel Wallerstein published in 1978 on this American journal created by Brodel, Review, which is an English version of Les Annales, more or less. And then you have an article by an American sociologist published in 1971 in La Revue Française de Sociologie, which is called Le Patron et son cercle, les clés de l'université française. Then you have more recently a book which has made a hit on the apostrophe and the media and the television by Hamon and Rothman, called Les Intellocrates, Voyage en haute intelligentsia, and it's a book that unveils all the kind of private connections certain scholars of the École have with publishing houses and the kind of networks that could be unveiled if you really want to see how Parisianism and intellectual life is led in the capital. It's a very interesting book. More methodological and scientific in basis are Michel de Certeau, L'écriture de l'histoire, Gallimard, 1980, and François Furet, L'atelier de l'histoire, Flammarion, 1981. All those books are more or less commentaries upon the issues raised by Les Annales around the end of the 40s after the Second World War. But as we will see very soon now, the role played by Les Annales has been more than crucial in determining the fate, the development, and the scientific issues of the École itself. Right. So, to create originally and to impose to the French institution, and to the French academic institution, to the French university, namely the old Sorbonne, to create and impose to the old Sorbonne a new institution devoted to teaching research was quite a challenge. The energy first had to be sought from outside the academic field, from outside the established people at the Sorbonne. to escape the established position, to escape the reproduction of the teaching body that the Sorbonne was very much specialized in, and to escape also the very strong hostility of the Faculty of Humanities and the Faculties of Social Sciences. This energy couldn't be found unless it was strongly helped and subsidized by private funds and had a heavy financial support. This support was done privately from the end of the 19th century till the Second World War, but not to such an extent that it could allow the école to exist by itself. And it is, in fact, because of the support of the Rockefeller Foundation in the 30s and later on after the Second World War that really the school could spring out and emancipate itself from these official university academic bodies of the Sorbonne and the French university. Nevertheless, and after the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation played a very significant role much later on in the 50s, especially around the creation of the cultural area centers and the Maison des Sciences de l'Art building. These two American foundations were obviously questions, the role of these were obviously questions and were assaulted by very strong political resentment by the French policymakers and by the French academics themselves. Braudel himself was accused at many points to be a CIA agent, where he was accused by the American of being a Marxist propagandist. So, and it is precisely because of those ambiguous roles that Braudel had the genius to organize that institute and to give it the aura it managed to have later on. So the paradoxical success of Braudel was to have launched a challenge to the academic partitioning and to the academic establishment, and to have given birth of an institution that would bring to these academic bodies revolution. But while bringing into them a revolution, it was creating another institution, which itself maybe would have to be revolutioned later on. So Braudel was playing on both sides, because at the same time he created the École des Hautes Études, he also was sitting as a chairman of the Agrégation d'Histoire. It means that he was at the same time at the utmost position of checking the training of historians at the Sorbonne, while at the same time being presiding over a derogatory and quite marginal institution. So to neutralize the sort of conflict that may have emerged against him too violently or too directly. This was also made possible because of the complicity of high civil servants like Gaston Berger, who also was accused of being a CIA agent in his time. Anyway, you see that the political context was extremely significant throughout the history of this institution, and I think I would have to go back to that a little further down in the presentation. We are, however, led to believe that at the end of that double movement of marginality and establishment, Braudel, in creating an institution which was fully legitimized, was bound to create in that institution itself the sterile opposition between accomplice adversaries it had himself had to neutralize against the Sorbonne to exist initially. So you know, this was a kind of a very ironical dialectic that once he had created this institute and established himself as an unchallenged leader, he somehow was from the inside in such a position that he had to comfort his power by getting a side institution, the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, to reinforce a sovereignty that in fact was threatened from inside at the Nevertheless, it was very well and very wittily played throughout the period. Okay, now Les Annales. I've already mentioned something about Les Annales. It's very important to come back to it a little now. Most of the merit of the école is invariably attributed to the success of the historians, to the journal Les Annales, and to the large team and body of historians that were making the institution alive. There is no doubt about it, though I have certain doubts on the way Les Annales themselves proceeded to establish that sort of supremacy. For if we look carefully in the archives and the history of these institutions, we clearly see that the most prophetic projects, the most elaborate proposals, the most achieved and matured ideas about what social sciences could go to were written and thought by sociologists of a Durkheimian obedience. And so, if we look that way to the history of the institution, we could consider that Les Annales were in fact the operating agent actualizing a project that was initially conceived by sociologists and anthropologists. And this would again give a very important light, I think, to the enormous conflict that raised in the 60s between history and anthropology, and the very ambivalent and difficult role Lévi-Strauss had to play in the Institute to maintain anthropology without being recuperated, while being, of course, as you know, extraordinarily recuperated by Barthes and all the semiology that went around him at that time. But it is a fact that in 1903, the first issues of what the social sciences should be was raised in an article by François Simian, who is a Durkheimian of the third generation, that in the 30s, Marcel Mauss wrote an elaborate project of 35 pages to the Rockefeller Foundation, claiming the necessity of an institution with a documentation center attached to it, and framing out intellectually exactly the way the cultural areas were created 25 years after, without those being acknowledged to him. Why Mauss' project was not received by the Rockefeller Foundation is something I may be coming back later, but I can always immediately tell you, because of the dates, 30-34, because of the fact that Mauss was outspeakingly a socialist, very much involved in militant socialism. And he had for opponents with the Rockefeller Foundation another social scientist called Charles Rist, who was an economist and who was a very conservative Alsatian bourgeois of the right hand, of the right political trend, rightist political trend, sorry. And so the Rockefeller Foundation chose Charles Rist's project on economy rather than Marcel Mauss' more ambitious and more widespread project on the social sciences, putting sociology and the anthropology first, much ahead of history. So this is quite interesting again, because when we'll see the kind of challenge that had appeared in the 60s, and even this kind of marginal situation of having an anthropologist for president for the last 4 years might explain a lot of things. Plus the fact that the historians maybe are nowadays in such an unchallenged position in their national recognition that they don't need to preside over the school to rule over it effectively. But that's another story. Next to François Simian and Marcel Mauss' project in the 30s and in the beginning of the century came a project written by Célestin Bouglet a few years before he died, just before the war, just at the moment of the Front Populaire, at the moment where Mauss was in full disgrace in the eyes of the American foundations, and where he tried to recuperate some of Mauss' ideas and to make them acceptable for the Rockefeller Foundation. Without much success, I would say, but for a punctual result in the institute he was himself ruling. Another person who is also a sociologist, and that makes the fourth of them, and also a Durkheimian, is Maurice Halbwachs, who also played a very important role in supporting the idea of social sciences and an institution which would be linked independently of the Sorbonne to sociology rather than to history. Right. So in a way, the Durkheimian failed because of historical circumstances, because of political conjunctures, and because of maybe a less skillful way to handle these proposals to the agencies that were likely to answer them. But where the Durkheimian failed, the historian succeeded. And the Durkheimian were mostly provincials. Their only way to communicate was through the Revue Française de Sociologie, but their institutional moorings were quite scattered throughout the Hexagone, whereas Les Annales understood very early that to have a journal and to have a scattered bodies of scholars throughout the country was not enough, and that they had to get the control of an institution to link the journal to an institution, and so to create a physical, an intellectual, and an ideological place where knowledge could be dispatched according to certain issues they were likely to raise, and they were keen to raise. So, Les Annales and La Nouvelle Histoire succeeded in what the École Française de Sociologie failed. It's also because of the historical circumstances, because as you see from that chart, the real école doesn't start before 1948. And maybe I'll have to come back very briefly onto the previous period to make you understand what I mean by that. Under Victor Duruy, the idea was to create a series of institutes within the old Sorbonne without an official status. But these institutes would be devoted precisely to research, to experimentations, and to a rehabilitation of facts, again the philosophical trends and abstractions devoted around the philosophers and the historians of that period in the Sorbonne. So Victor Duruy planned and accepted the project by Napoleon III to create une école pratique des hautes études that wouldn't cost much because the scholars would be brought in from various other places but would not be paid by the institute themselves, to provide classrooms, seminar rooms, libraries at minimal cost, to have this kind of workshop around a master and young scholars and young disciples that were to be trained under that master, le patron essentiel. So the first section was devoted to mathematics, the second to physics and chemistry, the third to natural history and physiology, the fourth to history and political sciences. Curiously, those four sections, which were at the root of the whole thing, today do not exist anymore. And so we have today officially in those records only the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth section, the fourth having been debaptized in the course of time. In 1888, a fifth section was created, but not the way Victor Duruy had projected. Victor Duruy wanted from the beginning to have a section of economic and administrative sciences, which was at that period a very kind of well-advanced idea. Nobody had in Europe, apart from England with the College of Aylesbury to train civil servants for colonial service, nobody had really an école for linking economy to administrative sciences in Europe. And this project didn't take place and was refused by the Ministry of the Interior, who was above the Minister of Education. Anyway, in 1888, a fifth section nevertheless was created, devoted to religious sciences, and came 2 years after the French government had decided to stop subsidizing religious institutions like the Catholic Institute and the Catholic universities. So in fact, this École des Hautes Études fifth section was an offshoot of the separation between the church and the state of that period, and it still exists. The religious sciences as the fifth section do exist now. In 47, at last, the idea of creating a sixth section of economic and social sciences took shape, and many reports were already prepared. For the last 13 years, the Rockefeller Foundation had already, given in money for private research centers, and that money created real teams and real publications which would made an enormous justification for having an institute collecting and putting all together this institute which were scattered. Right. So in 1948, what remained of all this first project was basically this. An école pratique fourth section, history, philology, epigraphy, numismatics, still exists. A fifth section, religious sciences, still exists. We have very famous Sanskrit scholars there. And the fifth section for economy and social sciences. Next to it was added a private foundation that could arrange private donations and join them to the state money coming and the Rockefeller funds coming officially there. Ultimately, in 1975, because of its growth, as you could see there, the école, the former sixth section, economic and social sciences, emancipated himself from the rest and became an independent body, which is still nowadays. Right, sorry, I hope it's not too complicated, but there it is. Right. Come back to Les Annales. So Les Annales succeeded and in fact took the control from 1947 onwards of that sixth section project and its realization later on, and still take control from even recently of the École des Hautes Études. Now, how can we interpret the fact that for the first time the president of the École is not an historian anymore, but an anthropologist? I would have loved to tell you that it was because anthropology had regained the legitimacy that was putting it on the first line, and but unfortunately I'm not in a position to say that because of the state of turmoil in which the subject is still is. Right. I think it's a series of parameters which are quite interesting, each for their own sake. The first is that there were no real candidate among the historians that would have been in a position to bring in consensus. So the idea of having a non-historian as a president was maybe the only way to neutralize factional trends within the historians themselves. The second idea that could be true, but not so true, is that to have an anthropologist for president is in a way to put anthropology as hostage of the historians, or as a scapegoat in a period of budgetary crisis. In other terms, the problem of the institution is so acute these days because of budget cuttings, etc., that the historians might have thought that it would have been handy to have an anthropologist to deal with bad times. It's not true, I think, nor it is true that Marc Auger is in any way an hostage of the historians, because he knew very well how to protect and to impose himself without their support or beyond their criticism. So, it may also convey another idea, and that's the one I've already told you, is that history, and in particular French history, national history, has gained such respect and such an audience in the public nowadays from the number of books, copies of books sold. It's more than obvious that they know that having control of many research centers within the institute, they don't really need to be officially there to rule over the policy of an institution. They are there in any case, through the direction of center, through the direction of scientific divisions. I'm not giving you there in the organigram. They are very much close to the president, which, in fact, among the 4 people he had to take in his private council, the three of them are historians. So it somehow relativized the absolute decisions the presidency has. Next to that, and to explain the importance of Les Annales in the history of the institution, is also a well-known image that Les Annales have really created a breakthrough in historical tradition. And here again I'm a bit skeptical, as skeptical as I am when they neglect completely the sociological inheritage and the Durkheimian role played in the institution. I'm a bit skeptical because first in the 30s, where Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch decided to create that journal and to invent what they called l'histoire problème, to substitute l'histoire problème to a chronological history, having a very strong accent on economy, on spatial geography, historical demography. They had in mind something which was, of course, original for France, but not so much original in the European context. In the air, already linked with the Histoire des Mentalités in the German Volkskunde, which, as you know, were totally beheaded by the Nazis period. And this Volkskunde tradition never survived the Second World War. Therefore, those other countries in Europe who have developed that or similar ideas at that time have now gained an enormous amount of capital of research that the Germans have lost for good. So the Volkskunde was very much there, where the Histoire of Mentality grafted themselves with. Second, certain reviews in Bielefeld and Heidelberg universities in the 30s were already dealing with economic history and the issues which were later to be raised by the Annales. And I think, though I am not very familiar with that journal, that in England the Economic Historical Review in the 30s was already there and was already devoting many of its contributions to that sort of problems, to which we are substituting a chronological history by an intellectual history. So again, and it's too bad for my historian colleagues of the school, les Annales are not that genuine. But again, if they succeeded against the Durkheimian in taking control of an institution, if they benefited from an historical context the Durkheimian never had, they also find their intellectual originality in a kind of devious way. They have managed to invent conflict, to invent the concept of crisis between social sciences. And they nourish themselves with that conflict. They survive by pleading basic differences between history and anthropology, and they reactivate those differences. Whereas if you talk to the anthropologists of the 60s, name them Condominas, Lucien Bernot, Lévi-Strauss himself, history, though it hasn't been on the foreground of their work, was a crucial importance and a crucial concern of them. I mean, the first person who has ever told me anything about the importance of history and anthropology is Lévi-Strauss. So when you see the sort of secondary thoughts that have been published in textbooks about the total absence of preoccupation, the total absence of concern for diachrony, the problem of cold and hot history, I mean, it has been made up afterwards. But in fact, and in many of his seminars, which may not have appeared as historical problems in publication, the notion of time was very much present in Lévi-Strauss' considerations. Right, it was a choice not to focus in his own work, but among his collegial life, he was absolutely in favor of the development of history, which is precisely what not only the Annales denied him, but I mean, caricatured his thought and played against it to create a debate and feed themselves upon a debate they would be the beneficiary of. So it's a kind of it's a very tricky way, it's a very interesting way to see when you look at all these issues of Les Annales over a period of 30 years, to see the sort of polemical incitations to revive a debate. And whenever the debate is fading away, I mean, somebody comes and then put it back again. And then the cultural area studies was basically organized around those lines of historicism and empiricism on the one hand, and structuralism and intellectual abstractions on the other, and being played at the expense of anthropology. Again, and I'm very anthropological centered today, but yes, obviously. If you look now on the program of teaching of the École over the last 15 years, you would see that there is hardly any seminars taught by an historian of the École who at one point is not mentioning the word anthropology. It's anthropologie des mentalités, it's anthropological, historical anthropology, it's anthropology of history, history of anthropology. Everywhere anthropology occurs. It has been totally neutralized by the historians themselves, who somehow feed on anthropology while denying it any value. The problem is, again, that the Durkheimian lost initially, the anthropologists are in quite a pretty bad shape nowadays. Still. Right. Next to that is the fact that, yes, it's time to say, is the fact that the école is some sort of an antechamber for the Collège de France. If I list you the people that first went to the école, to later on enter the Collège de France, you would see that there's a kind of a passage obligé through the école. Raymond Aron, Jean-Pierre Vernant, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, Pierre Bourdieu, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, Georges Dumézil, Sylvain Filiosa, Braudel, Mauss, Foucault. I think it's self-speaking. Right. So, I'm not sure I can't enter more into detail, but I mean, what I would like to do is just, yes, no, I think I'll just finish rather peacefully with a very preposterous quotation, which was made by an American and attributed to Hegel. I have not been yet in a position to check within Hegel's completed works where the quotation was coming from, but it's a very interesting quotation. And though it has to be played a little around. It is the role of ideas to create an institution, and it is the role of the institution to destroy the ideas that have created it. So there, I think, is clearly summarized the kind of issue that the institution nowadays would be facing in its next future. Last point to add to this is the specificity of the teaching scholars of the school was very much put ahead in the first 30 years of its history, namely because those who are professors here teach much less, significantly less than those who are at the university, and they also get less income. So the whole idea was to preserve that freedom of research at the expense of money to maintain the specificity of the school. But with the course of time and with the growth of this body of teaching scholars, you see, you had only 13 readers in 65, you have 67 readers in 88, doing exactly the same sort of teaching than the director d'études. And the director d'études have passed from 80 to 125. It means that there is a young blood who has come and who is actually in many ways shoveling the coal. Whereas the director d'études not only are more numerous, but they also somehow enjoy also their freedom. Nevertheless, they don't feel that the specificity of the school is as intense as it was in their own debate in the 60s. They would definitely prefer to have the same career than the university teachers, and therefore would be ready to leave the specificity of the school and the little advantages of less teaching. For maybe willy-nilly they might organize this through the maître de conférence, the readers and the annual lectures. I don't know. Nevertheless, the problem is that it is threatening the institution very much, and in two ways. First is that new regulations have passed by the ministry, and as you may guess, both the ministry and the university have some kind of strong resentment against the derogatory status of this school and the kind of privileges of having money, research fund, triangulation with this institution. So we are very much on the threat. And so the moment the directeur d'études asks for alignment with university professors' career, it's obvious that the ministry would not only, as we say, call back the lift, I don't know, but they would ask for compensation. And that precisely serves the purpose of the most reactionary trade union among the university teachers, the UNI, who wants really to kill the specificity of the school. So the specificity of the school would be killed from inside by putting professors of the same status and of the same income and with the same responsibilities as the professors of the university. Second, is that recently, to make this alignment accepted, the ministry said, okay, fine, you will get the same career mapping out than the professor of the university, but then, you know, these readers and senior lecturers who actually now have their career run by the ministry would not have their career run anymore by the ministry. They would have to come a specific body belonging to the school. So by neutralizing the professors in making them the equivalent of university teachers and killing the specificity, and by marginalizing the major body of assistants and readers, they would create a kind of weakness from the outside and from the inside within the institution. And it is precisely very tense these years. For the next 5 years to come, half of the professors of the école are likely to retire. And half of these 125 professors will have to be replaced. So even if the government leaves us 3/4 of this retiring staff to be replaced, you can see the kind of strategies that would have to be played by the president and his privy council to replace, and under what choice, what would be the scientific policy, under what criteria should we replace those retiring scholars. And precisely at the moment where the ministry has managed to pierce this way through and to fragilize the institution as it never has been earlier on. I think I would stop there.
Thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. I heard yesterday that the Greek word for gossip and anthropology is the same word, and I was expecting in some ways more gossip and less structure, but it's very good to have the structure first, and then we can maybe have some gossip informally now, the insideness. The only question I wanted to just take the privilege of the chair by asking one person who didn't mention, and it must be very difficult to talk about him, but I don't think his name came up. I don't know whether he fits in at all, but this is Louis Dumont, and I wondered in what way he fits in.
Well, this was part of the historical development I wanted to say on the cultural area development in the late 50s, and obviously he played a major role in creating and developing the whole infrastructure of the South Asian Research Center, definitely. But one other scholars could have to be mentioned too, namely Etienne Balache for the Chinese Research Center, and Vadim Eliseev for the Russian and Soviet Union Research Center, which is an enormous center, and also Guillermo Maz for the Chinese Research Center, which has an enormous documentation receiving all the daily newspapers from China for the last 45 years or so. So, I mean, all this cultural area would have, in fact, made a presentation on its own. I mean, this is really a fascinating subject to see how historians and sociologists and economists were actually debating over the issues of cultural area centers in the 50s. And especially having the Rockefeller Foundation trying to, it was the Cold War, McCarthyism, so accusing Brodel of recruiting or promoting Marxism, while Brodel was being accused of being an agent of the American imperialism. That's a really fascinating period, but I really could not enter into it. But you're right, and thank you for telling me. Obviously, I was not forgetting him at all. No.
Thank you, good. I think we have a unique opportunity. A lot of your talk was about Annales. And just by chance, we have Peter Burke here, who is one of the main exponents of the Annales school to the British anyway. And I wondered, Peter, if you had anything you'd like to ask.
I'm torn between the desire to express agreement, disagreement, and just ask an innocent question. Maybe just ask an innocent question in the space between
the disagreement, please.
And the gossip. And the question would be whether you think there is a mortality associated with this institution. I mean, we heard about factions. I'm also interested in l'esprit de corps, whether this mortality would spill over, and whether you still think there is a distinctive intellectual style associated with the people in Boulevard Spy and differentiating them from the people outside, whether all that's disappeared, whether that was
No,
20
no,
years
far
ago.
from it, and you're absolutely right, far from it. There is a tremendous corporateness in this institution, and I must say, it's a real thrill to work there. I mean, it's a wonderful institution. I mean, you have a building where you have all the documentation center, a general library, access to all scholars, all projects, an enormous amount of communication between people. I mean, debate, workshop, conferences, roundtables, everything is held within the same building. It's absolutely unique. You have no university that could compete with that in France. Not whatsoever. Factions and tensions are somehow inevitable. The problem, I think, which raises now quite crucially, is a sort of a split with the issue of recruitment. You see, the problem is that, as far as I can see, the école lives on a fantastic image, unchallenged image, presented image, but unchallenged, which lasted maybe till the late 70s, or quite recently. And the responsibilities of no one is involved there. I mean, it's not because of a bad president. It has nothing to do with a kind of bad director. But nevertheless, now there is an issue. I mean, half of the professors have to be replaced, and there is an enormous split, which in fact tends to show me that the image is not completely of the past, but the actual process of research and scholarship there is not as active as it was, because of a certain kind of obesity. I mean, it grew. I mean, like institutions, you know, they are bound to grow, to get fat, and to be less mobile. The fantastic new blood that was brought in the 70s is absolutely blocked nowadays. And so we have an aging body of teachers that have to be replaced, but by whom? And there comes the problem. Because you have two ways to promote people. You choose them from inside, or you choose them from outside. And apparently the policy is to balance internal recruitment with external recruitment. But for the external recruitment, there is absolutely no agreement on the kind of scientific policy to develop. And I think it's one of the most damageable absence of debate. Everybody is practicing self-glorification, what we have done, what we do, how beautiful it is, and then we have round table discussing all about that. But when the problem is to what are we going to do in the next 5 years, an example, 2 of the directors in psychology died, or one is really in a very bad shape. And so we don't know to replace the active psychology center for psychology there. Will we put a cognitivist, a geneticist? Will we put a social psychologist, an experimentalist? Nobody is able to face the debate. Do cognitive science have a place in the school in the next 20 years? The debate has been escaped for 7 years because of internal disagreements. So it's just bypass. That sort of things. What kind of anthropologists do we want for tomorrow? What kind of place do we want to give to cultural areas? Why is there so much of historicism again in the cultural area center, and why is there so less anthropology in the cultural area center? Why are historians more and more taking key positions again in that huge fat bureaucracy, and anthropologists are obviously marginalized? Why? So I mean, these kind of issues are not raised or are skipped, and they might not be planned by anyone, but it's a fact. And for the external recruitment, whom should we recruit? And unfortunately, the policy of, I would say, the star policy, kind of, you know, have a locomotive like in Chicago, you get Ricoeur for 2 years, and you get Foucault for 2 years, and it's bringing in students for 2 years, and then after it falls flat. Well, I mean, in a way, the Parisianism trends have become extraordinarily acute there. It means that we would, for instance, tend to recruit somebody because he writes in Le Monde and he's a well-known figure of, I don't know, Gallimard or Le Seuil, so let's come in and make him a scholar of him. And we have, I mean, an example, which is the only name I would say that things about, Derrida. Jacques Derrida. He's at the school. He gives a seminar. He's the most well-attended seminar in the school. You have 100 people in the room. But I mean, he doesn't participate at all in the school, in the life of the school. Whereas somebody like Roland Barthes, and it's something which is not known. Roland Barthes, despite, and I mean, apart from his academic achievements, was extraordinarily active in the École. He played a fantastic role. I mean, all these famous scholars, Louis Dumont, Condominas, Lucien Bernot, Brodel, they were not only scholars of first-rate quality, but they were, I mean, 7 days a week involved in the institute. It really had a life on its own. I mean, people were happy to discuss, to stay in the evening to discuss certain issues, etc. It was not like that sort of civil servantship from 9 to 5. And it tends to be a bit like that, and especially when these crucial issues came into the scene. So, so to come back to Derrida, I mean, he's very popular, but he's an absent professor. But as he's a Parisian figure, and more than that, okay. But when he can challenge many of his comments, especially when he deals with culture and society. But I mean, apart from that, it is not somebody that would bring in life in the institution. He would bring his own aura. Fine, we may need such people, definitely. But I mean, we also need people who are devoted. And those who are devoted to the institution now are considered to be part of the daily life. So they are not even rewarded for all what they do. I mean, we have people who are attending meetings, I mean, for the institution, who are taking charge of doctoral studies apart from their teaching, who are doing an enormous amount of administrative job, for instance, chairing research centers. And this is absolutely not counted in their CVs, and whereas it is 1/3 of their time consumed there. So this was a thing which was explicitly acknowledged during Brodel and during Yougov, and which tends to be people were happy to discuss, to stay in the evening to discuss certain issues, etc. It was not like that sort of civil servantship from 9 to 5. And it tends to be a bit like that, and especially when these crucial issues came into the scene. So so to come back to Derrida, I mean, he's very popular, but he's an absent professor. But as he's a Parisian figure, and more than that, okay. But when he can challenge many of his comments, especially when he deals with culture and society. But I mean, apart from that, it is not somebody that would bring in life in the institution. He would bring his own aura. Fine, we may need such people, definitely. But I mean, we also need people who are devoted. And those who are devoted to the institution now are considered to be part of the daily life. So they are not even rewarded for all what they do. I mean, we have people who are attending meetings, I mean, for the institution, who are taking charge of doctoral studies apart from their teaching, who are doing an enormous amount of administrative job, for instance, chairing research centers. And this is absolutely not counted in their CVs, and whereas it is 1/3 of their time consumed there. So this was a thing which was explicitly acknowledged during Brodel and during Yougov, and which tends to be slightly taken for granted. You know, you tell someone, oh yes, of course, he would do the job, doesn't matter. You see, that's a sort of reaction. So I mean, the challenge is really that an absence of debate, a tendency to have this national intellectual figure of a trendy way, and may not last 10 years, but I mean, if we hire them and they're 50, they will be there for 15 years, you know that.
Rubbing out the name of Derrida there.
The image you presented of the development of the centre is partly just, as you said, an organisation which has its own logics of growth and disintegration, like most centres built around a single principle, a single idea might be said to have. And also you've given us the theory of the historian's plot, the plot against anthropology.
Sorry, that's my English. If you understand, if you have understood the plot, it's not so much of a plot now. My English is betraying me. It's it's not a plot, but you create a debate to activate research and scholarship. It's very often the case. I mean, you challenge people with an idea, and then when the people start doting over the idea, you revive it by another one. And that's what exactly the Annales had a genius to suscitate.
But you're also suggesting that what you're seeing at the moment is the appropriation by historians of the word anthropology.
Yes.
And the use of that, whilst anthropology is in some way unable to meet that challenge within this institution.
Yes, for obvious reasons. I mean, the number of chairs in anthropology is incommensurable with the number of chairs in history. I mean, the field and the cultural areas where we could do field work are shrinking like anything else. I mean, just imagine for the last 20 years, all Southeast Asia almost have closed up. I mean, half of the African countries are not having any kind of technical or intellectual cooperation anymore with France. I mean, you have an enormous amount of places which render the practice of the subject impossible. So we have more and more students doing anthropology at home, which actually is just what I just did here. But I mean, you know, I mean, it's a real issue because I still have this kind of very traditional or even reactionary feeling that at least for a first fieldwork or for a first experience, an anthropologist should go to another culture than his own. So I mean, because of the absence of foundings, because of the closing up of fieldworks and countries, research visas becoming almost impossible to get in many places. Because of all these things, because of the absence of appointments due to the short number of chairs at the university, anthropology is basically in a bad position. And it's a vicious circle because we don't get the best students anymore.
I want to suggest, though, that you might want to look at a slightly different issue, or that issue indeed on another level, which is how history can constitute itself as a hegemonic discourse, and anthropology seems unable to exist except on the margins, a parasitic discourse. You've mentioned one very good reason why that's the case, that it was a discourse created for particular circumstances, and that those circumstances are now terminated. That would be a very gloomy view of our profession, but it would be one that some
But
people
it's
might
much
wish to
more
argue.
serious than that, because anthropology basically deals with, like the German would call that Volkskunde, we deal with the basis, whereas historians are basically the consciousness of nation states. And you can see the obvious reasons for that.
That's what I'm inviting you to reflect on. Maybe you don't need a plot, maybe you can just look at the unfolding of those discursive practices in
Yes,
that
but
way.
again, sorry, if I said or I misunderstood the plot was not in mind. Yes.
Stephen?
I was just going to observe that I don't really think you can really argue that it's... I think the technical constraints on the fieldwork are really not what's happened. I think there are much more powerful forces at work that stop anthropologists going abroad. They're not thinking... I mean, if you take the example of Lévi-Strauss founded in France a school of people interested in Amazonia, and Amazonia is really no less closed now than it was then, but there are much more wide, bigger fashions, but this is not a point.
No, I totally agree with you.
But I mean also there's the whole business of journal, etc. There's a whole intellectual issue going on in France about why you do field work at home. So I don't think it's got anything to do with government.
Okay, no, I do accept that, and to complement with one parameter I didn't mention is how can I put it? Yes, Jola, strangely enough, May 68 pass and the école absolutely unaffected. Everything went on. There was no turmoil, no real win, nothing. No, I mean, you're right about the fieldwork, but I would say that another reason is the total disinterest of policymakers nowadays. I mean, you won't deny that until the late 60s, from the American push, obviously, but also by ricochet, I don't know, by ricochet, yes, in France, I mean, somewhere the policymakers would promote research in social sciences in the hope that they would gain certain social control through anthropology and sociology. And now this is a kind of idea that is completely faded out, So maybe it's one better reason than the fieldwork. But I mean, nevertheless, for those involved in Asia, I promise you, it's a real problem. I mean, all Indonesia, the Moluques, New Guinea. It's very difficult now to get research visa there. And I mean, even in India, it's becoming more and more difficult and tricky to get permission to go on certain areas.
Looking around, there's a lot of people here because they're trying to get visas to do research in various parts of the world and they can't get in, so they come here instead. So.
Yes. From the perspective of an archaeologist as opposed to a historian or an anthropologist, your portrayal of Les Annales as the inventor of a conflict between the social sciences, which is very credible from the viewpoint of anthropology. But if you look at it from the view, and perhaps anthropology in the 40s and 50s, but I would like to know if you look at it from the viewpoint of history in the late 20s and 30s, then wouldn't you say that Les Annales was in fact trying to establish, you know, a whole, well, as you say, l'histoire problème, but to overcome the narrative history of the Sorbonne and to introduce the concept of studying all people instead of great men, and the concept of looking at material culture as opposed to political history. These were very important concepts for history, and perhaps what you say vis-a-vis the social sciences is true, but I think within history the impression I got was perhaps I felt that you didn't give a fair impression of Les Annales vis-a-vis history as opposed to anthropology.
Okay, well, that's also, I agree. It's also one thing. I had a larger section on Les Annales developing. I mean, I was very unfair because I only give an outline of what they were, but I mean, in detail, it's more complex than that. The various directions and secrétariat de rédaction, the various titles it took over the war. I mean, Lucien Febvre before the war and Lucien Febvre after the war obviously had different sort of interest and preoccupation. But I mean, you mentioned archaeology. It's interesting because Les Annales, as far as I know, have not really given much place to archaeology at all. They have not really welcomed debates among archaeologists. But, yes, and these kind of archaeologists they have promoted within the école are definitely very marginal in terms of archaeology. It's Jean-Claude Gardin. And like you could see, Gardin is one of those abstract semioticians in archaeology. He creates models which are quite polemical and difficult, difficult to receive by the archaeological community as such. Now you mentioned the political history of Les Annales. It's absent. Les Écoles des Annales, if there is one domain Les Annales has neglected or discarded, it's political history, but for Furet. But François Furet, who was the first to revive political history in the École. But look at the irony. There is no political history, and Les Annales continuously played a very significant political role as an institution by putting their relation of the journal within the institution. So in fact, academically speaking, they didn't speak at all of political history, but in their practice, they were constantly implied in political history. So it's interesting too. Now, Furet himself is quite fascinating as a character because, let's talk about names. Some of the person I really respect most is François Furet. He's a really great historian. But the ambition of Furet is very clear. I mean, he's fascinated by Tocqueville and he wants to be the Tocqueville himself. So it means that he is leading three careers at the same time. The great scholar of the Revolution, the great pamphletary journalist in the Nouvel Observateur, and the great political figure, because he's associated also with certain clubs, politically involved, etc. The political involvement also of the leading members of the École would have been very interesting. For instance, today, major figures of the school like Alain Touraine, Pierre Bourdieu, Marc Auger, and the fourth is François Furet. The four of them are in the PS, are socialists. But they all belong to very different factions within the Socialist Party. And so they represent, the four of them, the complementary trends of the Socialist Party, but sometimes it's a very conflictual trend. See, it's quite interesting also to look at it from this angle. And the political commitments also of the school, I would say, have become more explicit the last 4 or 5 years. But everything has become more politically explicit in France for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yes, I'm a French anthropologist, and I would say that one of the interesting things which occurs in your lecture that in France, in the heart of the university, the power is very closely linked to the political power, or even if it is well known. It's interesting to note, and I would be pleased to have the reaction of a British colleague about that. Well, I agree with you. L'école des hautes sciences sociales is in the margin of the university, but in fact it's in the heart, because there is nobody anymore in the French university. Well known. So
Yes, but it's likely to become a university by itself, with the kind of reform that I was pointing out. So,
now, is it, there's a lot of explanation about that. Is it because of the statute of the intellectuals in France, which is very high? Is it because of the special control of the French government on the university?
is it that high, the
I
status
think
of
so.
intellectual?
Not.
Oh, well, I'm not so convinced about
I
that.
think it's significantly different from England. It's at least paid lip service. Whereas I think there's definitely in England, those people do something peculiar, which has got nothing to do with political life, unless it's about economics or about think tanks. But I think in France, well, the way in which, as you said, Foucault writes for something which is taken seriously. I mean, I don't see any
Yes,
story
but I mean,
in England.
he's not
Maybe.
a very
Maybe
common
Thompson.
figure. I mean, he's an exception.
No, I think, I don't know, my
And I mean,
colleagues here,
Touraine would be another one, and because Touraine writes often in newspapers and for the South America issues and the foreign policy of France and stuff. Yes, some of them are explicitly committed, true. But I'm not so sure that, as such, the academic body of France is respected and highly regarded. I would say the école is, and that's why it's so nice to be at the école, because at least you live on certain safe reality. The other, the existence of a building, of an institution. No, but you're there. You have your colleague. You have a world. There is a social relation. Yeah, social relation. That's why I was making this relation with colleges and wherever they exist in England, because the kind of links you have between fellows in the college is in a way what the school is when it is working well. You see what I mean? But in general, no, we're just looking for jokers in France. I'll tell you, the best students would not go to the university, they would go to grandes écoles nowadays.
So I'd like to follow up your what I take to be a Durkheimian slant to your analysis and explore some more of the social composition of the school, perhaps relying less on the formal attributes of its members and perhaps on some other status categories. And there are many that I would like to find out about, but I think in view of the period we're talking about, from the 40s to the 80s, reflecting movements in society more generally, I wonder if you could comment on the place of women in this organisation and of their contribution to any changes in its culture or character.
Well, it's an institution, obviously, demographically male. Around the proportion. But what is interesting is, in your question, is that, in fact, yes, I could have done something that could have been very self-speaking, is to see the relative weights and names of subjects in the 40s, and the 50s, and the 60s, and now, in spite of that very rough quantitative chart. Yes, you're absolutely right. But I mean, if you consult the yearly book we publish, summarizing all the seminars, you can have a very clear idea of what exactly is at stake there. What is also very interesting, for instance, is this kind of secondary bodies, which I have not mentioned there, which are advisory board, which are directors of divisions. You have division d'histoire, division d'économie, division des sciences sociales, anthropologie, sociologie, division des aires culturelles. Okay. So each of these divisions is run by some person. The aires culturelles are now run by an historian of the most historicist mind. It means that he has a profound allergy to anthropology. He has a complete fascination for records, and he looks for records as he would look for, I mean, the divine relics of Saint Thérèse d'Avila. And this creates, as he's in charge of the Cultural Area Center, a whole scientific policy for the cultural areas. He's in control of the budget. He's in control of maybe 10 invitations of foreign professors every year. So it means that since he's come into the control of the Cultural Area Center, obviously the 10 professors that are invited through him during the year are likely to be much more of an historicist and the historian side of his own ideas than the anthropologist and what the anthropologist suggested to invite. So that sort of things, of course, played a tremendous role.
You mean there are no women in blacks at all?
No, there's no women, and there are women. Not said that, but I mean, yes, if we were to talk about these issues, obviously we stand very low.
1%. Chris.
Yeah. Can I just ask two questions maybe? One, a very pragmatic one about daily life for scholars in this institution. Made me start thinking about academic structures in Eastern Europe, where I'm familiar with universities on the one hand and academies of sciences on the other, and the great advantage of being in an institute in the academy is that you don't have 30 hours of teaching a week. And I realise it's not quite the same stark contrast here.
But we do the same for these people.
Yeah, I realise that. But still, the teaching responsibility for the people over there, you've got 2,000 students and really a rather a healthy staff-to-student ratio. My question, in this institute, which you said some people are still living for 7 days a week, in the centre of a very large city, what is it that actually brings in these academics to the institute, even 5 days a week? I mean, do they really go in and sit in offices or in the library in that institute from 9 to 5 and talk to each other in the coffee breaks or occasional round table? Do they not write at home with their computers like many of us would like to? We didn't have to come in for teaching responsibilities.
First, you should know that no academic in France would enjoy an office. Nobody among us has an office. You only have an office if you have administrative duties. If you're chairing a research center, then you have an office. And even sometimes you have to share it. But so most scholars actually write at home. When I mean that they made the life of that institute active, I don't mean by physical presence from 9 to 5. Not at all. But it is rare that a scholar will not pass a day in the week without coming through to get a book, to have an appointment with a colleague, to have lunch, to have a coffee in the cafeteria, to climb up a research center and ask for information. Everybody knows everybody in that building. It's a huge building with sheltering more than, I would say every day there are about 4,000 or 5,000 people coming into it. It's a 9-story building with 2 sub-basements, and I mean it's really active and alive, and everybody knows everybody. You know the secretary of the division, you know the librarian, you go to. I mean it's really alive, and that's what's very pleasant about that.
Well, it's not like Eastern Europe. Most people only go in on payday, which is once a month. The other question I wanted to put just very briefly, you mentioned Wallerstein's attempt to create an equivalent journal review. I wonder if you have any explanation for the failure of the Anglo-Saxon world, maybe of that effort in particular, or of any other journal, to get the same kind of reputation in Anglo-Saxon countries.
I don't know, I'm not aware that of the audience of that journal called
I don't
Review.
think it's that great, certainly not in this country.
What I can tell you is that it was originated by Brodel, that Wallenstein is in charge of it. I'm not familiar at all. I have only read those papers who were published to celebrate the 40th birthday of Les Annales, and I'm not at all familiar with that journal, whereas with Les Annales I'm much more familiar. I have myself published book reviews and articles in there. So
The answer is that Wallerstein is a schmuck.
It's also true that there was a journal in history which wasn't quite like Annales, but past and present in the 1960s and 70s was quite closely for the membership were all the highlights, and it dictated a lot of research. I wondered if I could, since there's no one else, just come back and put a provocative question and to be very open and frank and relaxed. If I avoid France like the plague. Academically, I've only been there once or twice. I think it's a lovely city, but I avoid the academic world of France. Partly because I fear it as a kind of tribal society. The images I have of it are of a much more tribal society, in the sense that the things that we have split apart, and it was referred to before in English culture, which is the world of politics, religion, academic life, and so on. We've made a great effort over the centuries to try and keep these apart, so politics doesn't impinge too much on academic life, although of course it does inform me to a certain extent. Whereas I have a picture of a world in which politics and religion and academic life are much more closely intertwined, and also a much more hierarchical world. You talked about patronage, but occasionally when I meet French scholars, they come and they say that all the seminars are very hierarchical. They always speak in order of seniority around the Levi-Straussian seminar, that you can't get anywhere in Paris without a patron. And the first thing, you had to have someone backing you. And though they find England a monarch and individualistic and so on, they also admire the fact that it's a multiple society where people have a good deal of freedom and they don't depend entirely on one person.
Okay, well,
am I right with all those?
I totally disagree with the first question, and I think you should come and visit it. First, and second is that no, religion, politics, and academic life are not that linked up together. No, not at all. I mean, I'm also sometimes struck that in total absence of political conversation in the école. I mean, no, it's nothing like Paris 7 or Jussieu from 68 or even Nanterre very often. It's very, very, very uncommitted politically. The second thing is that, with your second question, true, it's also my experience of both America and England that I was prepared to face a very hierarchical kind of academic life, and I, to the contrary, find a kind of a very liberal one. Right. But I would disagree in saying that, no, I mean, England is extraordinarily hierarchical, but it's differently hierarchical. You don't feel it the same way. Within the university, it's quite collegial. But I mean, if you leave that wonderful bubble that is Cambridge, and if you go to England and leave the university,
Yes, if you go to England, you'll find everyone doffing their cap.
No, it's terribly hierarchical, but it has its own ways of being.
What about patronage? Do I need to?
No, patronage. You're absolutely right. This is a world disease in the French system. This is absolutely true, and it is extraordinarily crippling, humiliating, and I mean, I am, if I may call it, paid for doing that, but not paid for it, because the problem of certain of us having been trained by the old gurus like Lévi-Strauss and Dumont, and myself, Louis Dumont, is that they were, I mean, Lévi-Strauss and Dumont were not patrons. They refused that sort of images, and they never patronized and had a network like other people had. I mean, they were very, very resentful against that. But they were also such figures that when they retired, those who were next to them and who were not supported by them explicitly because they were not supporting people politically or for career purposes, did suffer a lot. And if you're not part of a faction or a patronage system, it's obvious that you have to pay for it. I mean, ultimately things would come, but with 5, 6, 7 years delay. But it's better than anything else. I mean, if it is to lose 5 years, but to gain your kind of independence and not to deal with the courbette and courtship and le grand levé, le petit levé. I mean, Saint-Simon is still quite alive in this respect.
We have one last question back there.
This one's about funding, but since we're talking about hierarchies, may I observe as a Scot that all the references so far have been to England and the Anglo-Saxon world. So, if, say, let me put it to you, if you're going to apply for funds for a project, what sort of peer review committees does that go to? And what sort of, And in other occasions, would you have an opportunity to comment on the funding for a colleague's research?
I think it's extraordinarily limited. I mean, you cannot have any hope of having a project subsidized if you're not first part of the institution. Maybe I didn't understand what you meant.
Well, say, for example, in Canada, if I'm applying for an archaeological funding for an archaeological project, it goes to probably to SSHRC, Humanities Research Council. The actual project and its request for money will go to a smaller body of scholars appointed from a variety of disciplines, which will include anthropology, archaeology, perhaps history, and something else. And in turn, I may be called upon to comment on other colleagues.
Well, that could will be approximately the case for people who would apply to the CNRS there. That would go the kind of this sort of thing you just described. But the ecole is not entitled to provide that sort of money and committee and support. For instance, if I am in a center of Chinese studies and I want to do a project on a certain text of Chinese tradition and I need budget, so I would go first to my center and ask the director of the center to support my application for that. Then the director of the center would transfer the letter to one of those people next to the president that would talk about it to the president, and the answer would come. It would be voted by the scientific body, but in fact the decision would have been taken there almost individually. And if the project is quite technical and sophisticated, one of those persons would ask for an external consultant to give a scientific report. That's it. But I mean, this is not an institution that subsidizes research from outside of its members. So if you want to have your research subsidized by the école, you have to go through a research center of the école and a research center that would have to be subsidized by the CNRS to give you the money. I mean, it's just like in Germany, you know. I mean, state sovereignty means something there. I mean, it's not the kind of liberal game where you play here and there with your proposal trying to find. No, it's very, very well stratified, very, very well designed, and there are not so many channels you can compete and make rival to one another. You have only one or two ways to proceed, but ultimately you would fall back onto the same funding agencies. There is no other way. There is no other way. There is no any system like in the American university and probably in the Canadian ones, which are not state universities, of getting money through private funds and that sort of thing. This is a very highly nationalized sort of process.
I think that's where we ought to end. Perhaps I can end with an anecdote. We keep some of our ancestors, as you notice, around the walls here, and one of our ancestors there is Evans Pritchard. And I remember an anecdote which illustrates this point about freedom, he once told me, which was that he got on very badly with the chief patron, who was funded also by the Rockefeller, that is Malinowski. And Malinowski took him on one side one day and said, you will never get a job in anthropology in this country while I am alive. Now this would be the kiss of death.
Who told that to you?
Malinowski to Evans Pritchard.
Really? I must
He didn't until he died.
In fact, Malinowski played a very important role in supporting most projects with the Rockefeller Foundation, but he couldn't succeed. But he was trying to rehabilitate most despite his obvious socialist affiliations, etc. But I didn't know that. But how close Malinowski was to the Rockefeller Foundation?
Very close. He got a lot of money. But the myth, you see, you can never believe anything that Evans Pritchard told you. The truth is now denying. The next line of Evans Pritchard's story was, the next day, I got two letters, one from the University of Cambridge offering me the professorship, and the other from the University of Oxford offering me the professorship, and I took Oxford. And that's what Evans Pritchard said. It's all myth.